Good evening and welcome to the first of 3 of the Yeshiva University Library's February Book Talks. My name is Paul Glassman. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we're in store for a real treat. I'd like to introduce our 2 presenters. Seamus O'Malley is Assistant Professor of English at Stern College for Women, and Professor O'Malley's most recent book before the one that we're discussing this evening is Making History New, Modernism and Historical Narrative, which was published by Oxford University Press. And Professor O'Malley's research interests are 20th century British and Irish literature. And speaking with an interview with Professor O'Malley is Jeffrey Freedman. Professor Freedman is in the history department, and his Books Without Borders in Enlightenment Europe, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, examines the transnational book trade in the late 18th century. So tonight we're going to be discussing a book with the intriguing title, Irish Culture and the People, Populism and Its Discontents. Please help me welcome Jeffrey Freedman and Seamus O'Malley.
So I guess I get the ball rolling. Let me begin by saying how delighted I am to have had the opportunity to read Seamus's book, which is really a major accomplishment. I mean, it's just enormously impressive for the range of sources it deploys, for the cogency of its arguments, and for all the really fascinating questions it raises, some of which I hope we'll have a chance to explore. What Seamus does in this book is to track the shifting meanings of the people in the discourses of Irish nationalism over the longue durée. I mean, beginning in the 18th century, when amazingly, this is really news to me, the people referred to the Anglo-Irish landowning class and excluded the Catholic peasantry. Anyway, from there all the way to Sinn Féin and the IRA, and a story that was probably somewhat more familiar to some of us. And what he shows, really dramatizes, is just how much was at stake in definitions of the people, in the rhetorical uses of that term, in who got to define the people and who got to claim that they represented the people, or in a few cases even embody the people. That is a move that happens, I guess, more in the Catholic phase of this. Anyway, it's a fascinating story for anybody interested in Irish history, but not just for people interested in Irish history, because Seamus is always alert to the parallels and also contrasts with populist traditions in other countries. So it's a great pleasure, and maybe I'll just begin by asking you how you came to this project.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And thanks everyone for coming out. It began, like I always encourage my students to begin, like from a place of just confusion and happenstance, and I was drawn to a memoir by a guy named Ernie O'Malley, no relation. There's a lot of O'Malleys. And it's a memoir of the kind of Civil War period in the 1920s. He keeps talking about the people, but he was using it in such an interesting way. And who the people are in his book kept flickering depending on the page. So I was kind of drawn to the strangeness there. And so I wrote a kind of draft or something, and I presented it at a conference. And at the conference, it was at NYU, I got a really good kind of response and was able to kind of envision this as like a larger project than just maybe an article or a paper. And when I started researching populism, because populism wasn't a word I was using yet, I was looking at the people without kind of yet linking it to this political theory of populism. So it was about 2015 that I started just sitting in the library all summer long, just reading everything I could get my hands on about populism. And every once in a while, I would kind of poke my head up from the ivory tower and say, this is kind of like what's happening with Brexit. And then Trump came along, and I was like, this is kind of like, but I was like, yeah, whatever. And so I would just get back into my work, thinking that I was treating safely historical material, that populism was not something we would be talking about culturally or politically or socially. And so even though I became, expert in this topic, I had zero ability to apply it to what was going on around me. It's only much later. So I think my topic might look trendy, like it's just kind of chasing a kind of fad. It's the opposite. I had no idea this was even coming, so I think it's even more shameful. But yeah, from that kind of small section, it grew into kind of larger piece. And what I was basically able to do, and so why I think I enjoyed this book better than my first one, the composition. I was never trying to guide or kind of like, I didn't have any investment in the findings of my inquiries. And so I would just look at Irish texts and say, like, when they mention the people, who do they mean the people are, and who do they think they are speaking about? And the variety of the answers, sometimes even within one poem, would kind of astound me. And so not just over time, the way it shifts. I think that was a bit more kind of self-evident if you look at Irish history. And even American history too, right? That we the people, the way it's formulated versus how we use that phrase now. Whereas sometimes even within one work, there are conflicts and different ways of evoking the people.
So, Seamus, you alluded to the term populism, which is, of course, in the title of the book. And, I mean, it's not a label that any of the people, the actors in your story, would have applied to themselves. Right? So it's your term. What do you mean by the term populism, or what are the different meanings of the term?
Yeah, it's such a fraught word, because no one agrees on what it means. And yes, like you're saying, no one self-identifies as a populist. It's always what someone else is, and so the definitions are always coming from the outside, and that's why there's hardly any consensus on what it really means. Historically, there's only two real groups that use the term. One is kind of a Russian group in the 19th century, the other is the Populist Party of late 19th century America, and they have very little in common, and so it's hard to kind of force those two things together. I think for me that when I was looking through all these theories of populism, which themselves don't agree on what it means, for me the most freeing thing was once I came across theorists who saw populism as a way of speaking, as like a discourse, a style of writing, a style of talking, and it is a way in which people articulate the people as opposed to some sort of elite, some sort of either foreign or kind of on top elite force, and that sees a society as basically a tension between the people and the elites. And once I realized that it's a way of talking, that means that it's not glued to one set of political positions, that it can span the political spectrum. And that's why there doesn't seem to be one set of politics that we can associate with populism. So look at Donald Trump, but also Hugo Chavez, they don't have a lot in common politically, right? And yet they kind of evoke the people, and they blame outsiders, and they blame the elites for problems. And so it's a way of writing. And so once I realized, oh, it's a way of writing, I'm a literary critic. I can say something here about how it works.
Could you perhaps take us through some of the shifts in the meaning of the people in Irish history? I mean, it's dizzying. It's really a kind of floating signifier, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you just kind of map the terrain a little bit and tell listeners what the main lines of the story are.
Yeah, sure. Like 18th century Ireland has a lot in common with the United States, with like the colonial period, the revolutionary period, and both the American colonists and Irish Protestants are kind of drinking from the same well of Enlightenment political discourse, especially Locke and eventually Thomas Paine. And they are starting to shift the notion of political legitimacy as stemming from the monarch and towards the people. But the people is always this kind of nebulous phrase, and sometimes it means just everybody, the way we say, oh, people on the street. Whereas sometimes it's something much more assertive and legitimizing. And so then it's usually the people as those not landed, those not yet in power, but also those who have some sort of stake in society. They're educated, they often own property, And so those are kind of the people of the American Constitution and of 18th century Ireland. Just like in the US, there are all these contradictions, and so in Ireland you have these kind of very landed Protestant figures who are politically speaking for the people of Ireland, but by that they really just mean themselves when it comes to special political representation. So they don't include the majority of the population, which is uneducated Catholics. And so it's a very kind of top-down notion of who the people are. And it's very much in keeping. There's not much exceptional about that message. You see it in England, you see it in the US, and you see it in Ireland. What changes is that, unlike the US, there's a failed revolution in Ireland. Irish history is strewn with all these failed revolutions. And this one's in 1798, and it's a total disaster. And the notion of Irish independence from Britain is just totally removed from the table, and it's not for another 130 years before it becomes a possibility. And because of that, the notions of the people change. And at the same time, Irish writers of all kind of stripes are starting to look to continental Europe for cultural inspiration, especially to Germany, but then increasingly to France. And there's this new idea of the people that doesn't originate in Ireland, but that's kind of seeping over into Ireland. And this idea is less about kind of the educated, and more about the people as those who are kind of rooted in the soil, those who have the kind of deep roots that kind of the new forces of nationalism are looking to. And so in Ireland, those kind of roots are kind of religiously coded. So it's Catholicism that almost acts as a kind of ethnicity, in the way it still does in Northern Ireland. And so in that instance, the people become increasingly the Catholics as opposed to the Protestants. So it's within about 50 years that the word becomes its own the phrase becomes its own opposite. And I find that so fascinating, and it kind of shows the malleability of the phrase. And then as the century continues, it becomes especially associated with kind of the poorer Irish of the West, the cottagers. They're often the Irish speakers, but they're a shrinking portion of the population. I think it's by 1840. Only a minority of Ireland speaks Irish, whereas mostly English-speaking and often Protestant, non-Irish speaking writers start saying they are the true people, right? They are the real ones. And we still have that with us, right? In journalism, you see kind of going to the greasy spoon diner and like, these are the people. So that is a very kind of 19th century notion that those who are rooted in the soil are more the people. But then the final kind of twist comes in the 20th century with the rise of mass media, the rise of journalism, and then you see more kind of the people as like, oh, the everyman, the guy on the street. It's often male. It's almost always the male who kind of occupies the image of the people. And so the 20th century then produces much more of a notion that becomes one that some critics look at like the people as like the masses, which is always like a threatening collection of individuals. Whereas the people are legitimate, whereas the masses are scary. And the masses can quickly become a mob. And so this is another kind of fear and concern of the 20th century. So the history of the people as a phrase has a lot in common with what's happening in the United States, but also sometimes seems more like what's going on in Germany and France. And it does not have a lot in common with the United Kingdom, or Britain, I should say, even though it's in English and the phrase comes from England. It goes in a very different direction after 1798, after this failed revolution.
In order to tell this story, you draw, as I indicated in my initial comments, on a remarkable range of sources, including canonical works by Yeats, and pamphlets, newspapers, and you read these things side by side. I mean, that's the kind of interesting methodological move that you make. I mean, do you apply different reading strategies and reading different kinds of texts, or do you just like treat them all on the same plane?
Yeah, it was a very leveling process I think I was doing, and I looked at a lot of newspapers, which I had a lot of fun just kind of looking at how various newspapers, who they think the people are when they talk about the people. But I kind of used the same approach to, some of Yeats's best poems. Usually, a great writer like Yeats is more kind of in control of what's happening with language, and he's more attuned to the obfuscations that happen with this phrase, the people. But even Yeats sometimes doesn't quite know what to do with this phrase. And he's in love with this woman, Maud, who he kind of associates with the people, and that always kind of clouds his thinking, but also spurs his creativity. So yeah, my approach was not that different depending on the genre of writing.
So, I mean, a lot of this reads like the work of a historian, and since I'm a historian, you may take that as praise. I mean, it's a really, I mean, the chapter on the Easter rising and so forth. I mean, I could, if I hadn't known, I might have thought you were a historian. I mean, but you're, on the other hand, you're trained as a literary scholar. What do you think you bring to this kind of project as a literary scholar that a historian maybe wouldn't have?
Yeah, I think because populism becomes a way of speaking as opposed to a set of politics, I think when historians approach populism, they might be just by training, right, by looking for a certain set of positions related to historical issues and historical developments. Whereas I was kind of looking more at a kind of language, kind of discourse that, despite all the changes, is very steady, very the rhetorical gesture of like, these are the people, these are the foreigners have ruined the system, the people should be in control of the system. That's so consistent across the globe. You see it in Latin America, you see it in Europe, now you see it in India. And there's something so steady about that, that it's almost like ahistorical, right? It's not about time and place. It seems like it's just rhetorical. There's a way in which anyone can say that. And so I do, of course, try to tie it to the history, but there's a way in which literary analysis can help kind of isolate it or see it as a way of speaking.
So a practice of close reading, or
right, exactly.
Of course, historians, we would probably say we also do close reading.
Oh, sure, definitely, yeah. Right. But yeah, one of my favorite literary critics is a historian, Guy Boehner. He's Israeli, but he writes about Irish history, and his specialty is the 18th century. But it almost bugs me how good a literary critic he is. It's almost. But in Irish studies, there's often an overlap between historians and literary critics. And one reason for that is like the centrality of literary culture in Irish history. And so, like the Easter Uprising, which was probably Ireland's biggest historical event, if you look at kind of things that still get discussed. A lot of the participants were poets and playwrights. And James Connolly, who's a kind of socialist political leader, one of the last things he did before staging this uprising was put on a play. And so there, in Irish culture, there's just a heavily literary culture that bleeds into what we think of as history proper. And so Irish historians and Irish literary critics always feel like we're able to kind of cross the boundaries. And so I think in Irish studies there's going to be zero feathers ruffled from, from what I'm doing. Whereas I don't see that in British scholarship. You know, there's much more of a separation.
So, in terms of Irish literary history, and I realize that you know this is not a book exclusively about Irish literature. In fact, it's precisely that kind of opposition that you're just trying to break down. But in terms of Irish literary history, I mean, we have Yeats in here, of course. But there is a conspicuous absence, as I mentioned, almost absence, right? I mean, the biggest, the most famous name of all doesn't play a role, right? Joyce is not in it. Amazing. And I imagine, even though you end your story with the establishment of the Republic, right, in the 30s. But if you extend it to chronology, I don't expect there would have been room in this story for Beckett either. No, right. Okay. So Beckett and Joyce are the two most famous Irish literary figures, and yet they don't. You know, they. I mean, does your history of Irish populism help us to understand those people who are outside of that discourse? I mean, does it maybe produce its dialectical antithesis in the form of a kind of Francophile, expat, modernist cosmopolitanism?
Right. I think so, with the caveat though that I struggled with the title, as all academics do, but I wanted the notion that this book is not just about populism, it's those who critique populism very heavily, and so that's why I included the discontents, because so many of the writers I looked at were anti-populists, whereas Joyce and Beckett don't even engage in the conversation around populism. Yeah. You could almost look at any of their works and kind of say the same thing when it comes to populism. Like, they don't care. They deliberately turn their back on the very notion of populism. And Joyce usually spends zero time even engaging with it. And the one time he does is an essay he writes when he's very young. It's called The Day of the Rabbleman, where he foresees pretty accurately the kind of populist direction the Irish cultural revival is going to go in. And he says there's going to be problems, and he's kind of saying, like, I want no part of it. And his whole career really is trying to duck that way of discourse, right? That way of talking. So much so that he won't even argue back against it. I think Beckett too. You see Beckett's like silence, kind of characteristic silences around populism, which are, I think, also in a sense, Beckett, like kind of predictable, given who he is. Yeah, that's Cosmopolitan.
French.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, writing French. No one's even gonna like read it back in Ireland, right? So yeah, they seem totally devoid. Whereas Yeats also sees himself as an avant-gardist, reads a lot of the same works that Joyce does. Joyce is big into Ibsen and Nietzsche, and Yeats is also as enthusiastic about these avant-gardists who kind of have ideas about the people. Because it's Ibsen who writes a play called Un Folkfiend, which means the enemy of the people. But for Ibsen, this is what you have to be. You have to be the enemy of the people. You have to risk the disapproval of the crowd to be a true hero, a true artist. And Nietzsche says the same thing. And so both Yeats and Joyce are like, yes, that's us. We want to speak the truth against the people. And that's what Joyce does. He has no qualms about frank sexual material in his work or unapproachable literary styles. Whereas Yeats can't do that. He can't give up the idea that he's still the friend of the people or the spokesperson of the people. So he wants to be the friend of the people and the enemy of the people at the same time. And he keeps insisting that, no, the populists have it all wrong. The populists don't speak for the people. I can speak for the people. And so he goes through all these rhetorical gymnastics trying to kind of maintain himself as the true friend of the people, even as he's the enemy of the people at the same time. And like logically, rhetorically, it makes zero sense at all, right? It's an untenable position. But he's doing amazing things. He's like building these amazing bridges that don't exist. And so I found that effort by Yeats much more interesting through the lens, as opposed to Joyce, who just kind of doesn't really engage.
Well, I mean, I gather from what you said that, I mean, Yeats is a populist in as much as he, well, he constructs a kind of fanciful image of the people. It's entirely a product of his imagination. Right. It's not actual. Right. People.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yes, you would go. He and Lady Gregory, his friend, who was from this landowning family, but spoke Irish and would talk to her tenants in a very kind of problematic way. If your landlord's interviewing you, you're going to say what she wants to hear, right? But in a sense, she knew the people better than Yeats did. They would both go to like a cottage, and she would go in, and he would wait by the door, and then she would write something, and he would write like a whole story about what he had encountered. Mostly just made up, mostly just. But for Yeats, that was the point in the first place. The point of going to the people was to fertilize the imagination of an artist. And that's not a new idea from Yeats. That's a very 19th century, often very German idea. Right? You go to the people for inspiration because they are of the soil, right? The metaphor is very deliberate, right? They're supposed to nurture, they're supposed to grow from the soil. So the idea of kind of making it up is not, that's not a problem for Yeats. That's like, yeah, that's what I do. I make things up. But it often comes across like, oh no, I spoke to a real peasant. I really did have this interaction. So yeah, for Yeats, it's a whole different relationship.
Right. I don't know if I should ask this question because it's actually, I'm perhaps inviting you to put on a different hat rather than your kind of historian's hat. But is populism good for literature or is it bad for literature? I mean, does it? Yeah. I mean, because it is, as I said, the best authors in Irish history stand outside of this tradition.
Right.
People who Or is that not, do you balk at offering a judgment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of what I was trying to do with the book is kind of show how populism has had this shaping impact on Irish literature. What I didn't say is whether that was kind of healthy or not. I just tried to kind of like state the facts as I found them. For Yeats, I think without populism there is no Yeats. Like even though he turns against it, he needs it to turn against it. If that makes sense. He needs that kind of friction. And I think the problem I encountered, and Martin was a big help with this in terms of the way kind of French art history has kind of worked with notions of the people. If you depict the people in any sort of, I always use the word empirical, there's maybe a better word, but if you actually try to say who the people are, it always falls apart. I always use the example of Joe the plumber. Do you remember him? He was Sarah Palin's like sidekick for a while, and she was like, "Look, this is the people. This is the actual voice of the people." And it turns out he wasn't a plumber. His name wasn't really Joe. Like, every time you try to specify, like, "Oh, this guy is the people," there's always a problem there because you could never really, with even just a few people, depict who the people are. And so you often see, if you go to the post office or something, there's like a poster and there's like 8 people and they try to get every race and every gender, right? It's like, that is never aesthetically satisfying, right? It's just kind of doing what it has to do. And so painting often, French painting during the revolutionary period, most famously in Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, it's like he dared to depict the people. He was like, all right, it's this guy with the top hat, he's the bourgeoisie, this guy's a printer, and viewers can look and say, oh, I guess this conglomeration of individuals is the people. But even almost before the paint dried, people were saying, well, that guy's not really, like, there was already debate within a couple years of that painting over who the people were. And so if you risk actual representation of the people, something always goes wrong. But if you depict the people's enemies, if you deflect it, if you say, instead of depicting the people, I'm going to depict those who are preying upon the people, or those who threaten the people, you're in safer hands because you could just kind of keep projecting something. And so it's often kind of more indirect methods of representation that have that kind of power. And so the painting by David of the Death of Marat, Marat is the friend of the people. That's the name of the journal he's writing as he is killed. And so you see not the people, but the people's friend as assassinated by the enemy of the people, which is very indirect. But for me, that is just a masterful use of engaging with the notions of the people. So when it comes to literature, the same kind of limitations kind of factor in, where writers who try to depict the people, something always dates very quickly, or something always kind of falls apart. Whereas those who are kind of more looking at the effect of the people, or those who are not the people, are usually more interesting aesthetically. So I don't think it's easy to say in terms of, kind of good or bad, like the effect of populism. I think it's more that it creates this aesthetic challenge of representation.
Right. So maybe I'll ask one more question and then we'll open up the floor. Does that seem like a good plan? So at the end, you sort of fast forward to today, and this is where you come back to sort of comparative analysis, and you observe that Ireland seems to have escaped the populist moment, at least for the time being. I mean, there is no Irish Trump or whatever, Marine Le Pen, Orban, Netanyahu, Bolsonaro, and so forth. Right? So, and you think that that can partially be explained in terms of the past history. Or maybe you would like to explain, why do you think Ireland hasn't had a populist movement, and what exactly that means?
Yeah, so I have nothing original to say about why populism has why Ireland seems to have ducked the global populist movement. Maybe moment is a better word. There's a couple theories. One is that, especially in Europe, populism is, especially in Britain, an anti-EU gesture at this point. And Ireland needs the EU. No matter where you politically align yourself in Ireland, you kind of know you need the European Union as a kind of counter to this giant economy of Britain that's right next to you that you're competing with. So Ireland can't turn its back on the EU. Also, an engine of populism in the West is deindustrialization. You see this in kind of the American heartland, right in the Midwest. You can see it in the north of England, north of France. Ireland never really industrialized at all. It kind of never got there. And so it never went through a deindustrialized phase. It went through the Celtic Tiger, then the crash in 2008. But even the crash was not a post-industrial crash. It was almost like a post-information economy crash, which led to a whole different way of kind of reconfiguring people, kind of people's mindsets. And so for that reason, too, Ireland's not going through a populist moment. But what I found most interesting, though, is that in reverse, why then is so much of the globe going through a moment much like Ireland's formative years? Like, okay, we're not like Ireland now, but why are we like what Ireland was 100 years ago? Why does India and Israel and Britain and the United States seem to be in this moment where we are talking in the same way that people were talking in the year 1900 in Ireland? How is that all possible? And I'm not exactly sure, right? It seems like in both cases, there's a breakdown in trust, there's a breakdown in kind of social institutions, there's crisis of legitimacy, and this is often when talk of the people starts to grow.
Although, I mean, one of the characteristic features of our populist movement today is that populist movements tend to focus on a charismatic leader, right? I mean, so, again, whether it's Trump or Bolsonaro or Orban, but that wasn't so much a characteristic of the populist tradition in Ireland, really. I mean, there is this, somebody who has the aspiration to embody the people, right? And who makes that a credible claim.
Right. Yeah, I think at moments when the charismatic leader tries or succeeds in at least temporarily, rhetorically embodying people, I think a lot has to go right historically for that to happen. Whereas in Ireland, there are too many actors at work in the early 20th century, and some of them just die, and some of them just are killed in the fighting and don't kind of live to be that embodiment of the people. Whereas the Irish Prime Minister who reigned for so long, Eamon de Valera, even though it's hard to call him a charismatic leader, he was a very canny populist. And in one of my chapters, I look at how he used his newspaper, the Irish Press, to kind of produce the people in ways that helped his political career. And so, in that sense, even though there is no Hugo Chavez in Ireland in 1920, in a sense, that role was kind of distributed amongst a few figures. So it doesn't conglomerate into one person, right? But I think the role, and especially the combined rhetorical effect of all these writers and politicians I look at, I think they're serving a similar function. And they never pretend to be the people of the people, right? They're often one degree removed. That's usually what the charismatic leader is doing anyway. It's like when Trump says, "Trust me," that's what he's doing. He's saying, like, I live in a gold house. Trust me, like I know what it's like. And so they don't have to pretend to be of the soil, right? They can be from elsewhere.
So I think maybe we'll open up the floor to questions.
I won't give a chance to talk about Yeats, so it's awesome. So it seems to me like when you look at poetry and populism, a lot of what you're looking at is the history of form. And when we talk about populist aesthetics and poetry, to boil it down to brass tacks, we're talking about spokenness and rhyme, meter. And in Yeats in particular, the populist Yeats is the late Violet Esprit and poems that can be sung in bars.
Yeah, really stuff.
But I mean, you make the point that his work maintains the tension between populism as it becomes increasingly a modernist. And my way of understanding that comment is to look at how he maintains formalism as a modernist, unlike the people he identified with as his peers, Pound, Eliot, Stevens. And so it seems, do you agree, it seems to me like one of the magic ingredients in populism and poetry is formalism. And the other is, it sounds like somebody's saying it. That starts with Wordsworth, right?
Yeah.
Lyrical ballads.
Right.
And modernism is anti-populist because specifically when it rejects those things.
Yeah.
Now, American poetry, it gets all messed up because American poets have a habit of getting confused about the formalist prerogative in populist aesthetics. Whitman made this mistake, right? So he wants to be the poet of the people, and he writes free verse and no one reads it except Emerson and other elites. And he becomes instead a cult hero for the nascent New York LGBTQ plus community and so on. He becomes a cult poet. He's popular in his own way, but not in the way he hoped. He's not sung in the streets by millions. But he realizes his mistake. When he gets to Lincoln's death, he realizes that the only chance he has of being sung in the streets is if he writes, of course, O Captain, be Captain. So he makes a specific nod to populism by turning to form the only poem in his whole body of work that rhymes. So Whitman finally figured it out.
Right.
So Williams never did. He kept trying to milk that cow and he never got him anywhere in terms of the popular audience. He wrote some great poetry. So I don't know, how does I guess turn it into a question at the end, how does this sort of play out for you in terms of formal aesthetics and poetry?
Right.
What are the elements of populism in poetics?
Yeah, because one way of looking at Yeats's career is his best known poetry is his what used to be called high modernist poetry, The Tower, Sailing to Zane. And he writes those poems in the early 1920s, by which point he's turned his back on the populist movement of the Irish Revival, and he's decided that populism is a detrimental force to Irish culture. He calls it a middle class affair, which for Yeats is like the worst word you can call someone. And he says it's the elites, often in allegiance with like the people who produce the best poetry. But he says that the people and the elites both value like the esoteric qualities of poetry. And so this is completely just invention, right? But it helps him justify this increased formality, this increased attachment to form that we associate with modernism. And so it's clear he's distanced himself from populism, but or from the people even, but he'll deny that. He'll say, no, I'm actually getting closer to people by writing this esoteric, unpenetrable poetry. And so no one agrees, right? But that's his self-justification. So that's what I find interesting, the fact that he really thinks that a poem like The Tower, which takes...
his justification is what, the mystical tradition in like Irish mythology? Is that how?
Yeah, he says that only the middle classes want clarity. He says the baker wants clarity, whereas the farmer is okay dealing with myth and symbolism and the occult.
So the plays probably fit in there too.
Right. So it's total invention, but again, that's what Yeats does. He just makes it up.
Well, I kind of have a question, it may be something not related to that at all, but it's kind of like the flip of Jeff's last question, which is whether you think that people as a concept or as a discourse is still used by contemporary Irish, playwrights or the Sally Rooney's of this world, or whether that's completely, I was kind of thinking, is it useless to them, or is it still something that kind of can inform how they write?
Yeah, I think it is, and they even, I think, use it only ironically. If someone like Sally Rooney's going to use it, it's going to have a certain valence, right? And I date that back to the 1940s. There's a writer named Flann O'Brien who wrote under a pseudonym a newspaper column, and sometimes, it's a very funny column, sometimes he would interview the people, and it was always like a joke. And so once you can kind of put the people in such like a bald presentation, that means it's kind of over, right? You can no longer kind of evoke them with that sort of earnestness. And I think that way of relating to like the phrase the people still kind of dominates. So yeah, I looked all across contemporary literature. I found almost nothing to comment on. The exception though is Northern Ireland, which is its own thing. And in the original draft of the book I sent to the publisher, I had a chapter on Northern Ireland. And one of the peer editors said, like, interesting, but tells a different story, cut it out. So I said, okay. But yeah, up there, and what I find interesting up there, just very quickly, is when you say the people, if you're Protestant, you mean Protestants, if you're Catholic, you mean Catholics, and so no one ever means everybody. And both sides seem to agree on that. And you can even, if you walk through Belfast or Derry, you see graffiti, and if it says we are the people, that's Protestant. If it says power of the people, that's Catholic. And so everyone knows, it's just like an obvious. So yeah, up there it still has that power, whereas yeah, in the Republic.
So maybe Irish, maybe Flannery Bryan has saved Ireland from populism.
Exactly, yeah. He inoculated the nation, exactly.
If I could just actually piggyback on one thing that Will said. So it seems to me that in the story you tell, political and cultural populism develop in tandem, right? And indeed, it's often the same people, Sean Casey or whatever, is playing two roles. But today, I mean, so we're living a populist moment, but political populist moment. Is there any? I mean, can you think of, for all the, I mean, I don't really know what the literary scene is like in Hungary today. I must confess, I'm completely ignorant. But I mean, the fact that Orban is in the ascendant, right, I suspect doesn't mean that Hungarian authors think that their role now is to glorify the Hungarian. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, these things maybe have become detached from one another.
Possibly, yeah, but there was not in literature, but there was something in England called the Poppies Project. Do you ever know about this? It was the anniversary of the centenary of the Great War, and I think it was around the Tower of London. They made something like 800,000 ceramic poppies, one for each soldier who died in the war. And art critics thought this was just the most trashy, sentimental, populist thing ever. Whereas it was a phenomenon. It was just so popular. One of the most popular art events ever in England. And I think it was 2014. And I saw a presentation on it years later. And after I saw the presentation, I was like, I understand Brexit. Everything became clear to me after the unexpected hit of this art event. So I think there is still a way in which culture is kind of, related to what's going on politically. And sometimes even there first, even before. This is before Brexit, this is before, this was, 2014.
A related question has to do with what you think is the relation between populism and nationalism. Because all the sorts of examples that Jeff was outlining in the 21st century, these are very clear nation states that have gone through independence decades, if not centuries before, and there's a turn towards populist discourses, formally and politically, as a way of securing a certain kind of national identity against the cosmopolitan, the EU, the transnational, the global, the neoliberal. And what's so distinctive about your account is that Ireland isn't a nation until after populism seems to disappear from the poetical and political discourses. So it's sort of in an inverse relation. Once Ireland is established as a nation state, populism is no longer a necessary discourse. Is that right?
I think it is. That might be a colonial situation in the sense that, if we look at 19th century Europe as the emergence of these nations, kind of using the idea of the people as the source of the nation state, which is a very new phenomenon, right, historically. But at the same time, you have the growth of the empire, which for Ireland is nothing new, right? But throughout Africa and Asia, especially. And then there's almost always a populist element to kind of anti-colonial nationalist movements, like India or Algeria, especially. And so in those cases too, populism is like a tool, and that once it's been used, it's not automatically going to continue. Sometimes it does, right? But it's not automatically going to continue. So I think in Ireland, once independence was fully established, there was less of a need to kind of deploy this language. And so I find it interesting that it drops out both politically and culturally at the same time. So yeah, it might be a kind of function of Ireland's colonial status as opposed to Germany, France, Italy.
Is it glued to nationalism, though? Are those two things like inextricably tied together?
They often show up together. Not exclusively, I think, but I think Marxism in the 20th century tries to kind of use the phrase "the people" in a transnational, international way. So there are kind of sometimes forces that will kind of talk about the people.
Well, I mean, the 1798 uprising, with the backing of French revolutionaries, of course,
Yeah.
it might be an exception in the sense that the people there, and I don't know the history well, but from what I remember, the uprising really is centered more in Northern Ireland than it is in Dublin and the West.
Right.
And so there is actually a kind of very strong alliance between Protestants and Catholics, in a sense that the people in 1798 in Ireland does sort of stand for the universal, or the collective, or everybody against the nation, England.
Yeah.
Well, the Ulster Presbyterians, right, but not the Anglo-Irish.
Right, yeah, Ireland has two kinds of Protestants.
Right, yeah. And that gets off, I mean, I think a lot of people who study Irish history are aware of that, the important distinction.
Right.
Yeah.
And now they explore a little bit more, but in the 17th century, that was the English Civil War, right? They're not folks that get along all the time.
I was wondering, within, like every country we have, I say this, minorities or subcultures, you know, especially this country where it's so, you know, like mosaic. So do we have like, you know, say about blacks, for example, there might be a populist kind of, you know, within their writings, you know, Latinos, you know, would it, so, I mean, could it, you know, so could populism be defined that way as well? So
Yeah.
with the specifics, you know.
Right. It could. You could look at kind of I was interested in the populist discourse, for example, the Black Panthers, the kind of power of the people. Like who do they envision the people as? And for them, it's kind of the people in their community against the police, right? Against the white kind of establishment. And so you could see on the one hand kind of local populisms like that, which we might call national. We often use the word black nationalism, even though kind of nation's not exactly the thing we talk about. But at the same time, in any diverse community, can become the people as long as there's an enemy. You just need the enemy. You just need that outsider. And that's why Jews serve such a convenient foil for 19th century nationalism, because you define the people by the outsiders. You define them by those who are not of the soil. So in that sense, diversity is always a feature within whoever the people are being called. There's always contradictions. It could be class, it could be religion. As long as there's someone else, there's got to be that other figure to blame. And so that's kind of the poison of populism, that it almost always needs some kind of enemy. And maybe some people deserve to be demonized, right? But we all know some people don't, right? So that's why it's so powerful, but also so dangerous, because it's so easy to cast those that say they're not the people as an enemy.
I think you said it in the 20th century, populism kind of took the form of the everyday man.
Yeah.
You also said that it's usually kind of in contrast to an other or an outside group.
Right.
So what do you think that says about how women were treated at this time, that they could kind of have a successful trait of being male in populism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one way I tried to attack that was with some kind of Irish female writers who were going right after this issue, right? This issue of women as always excluded from the people, but always in a sense in the background, right? So a typical kind of populist painting in Ireland will often have like a farmer, and then his wife is there, but she's clearly playing a second role, right? So she is included, right? She's not the people, but she's also not ever going to be the spokesperson of the people. So she's both present and absent at the same time. Unlike an English landlord, right, who's never of the people, right? That he's always excluded. Whereas, the wife, the daughter, these are often present, but also secondary at the same time. So they're not exactly excluded in the same way that populism is never going to call women the enemy of the people, but it's also not going to use them as spokespeople or as kind of their main symbols. So it's an always interesting tension there.
What about allegorical personification? I mean, Marianne.
Right. And in Liberty Leading the People, Marianne's there, right? She's the allegory. But is she the allegory of the people, or is she the allegory of liberty, right? It's Yeah, T.J. Clark.
I don't know.
Martin.
What do you say?
Well, like,
No, she's liberty.
yeah.
But I mean, but Marianne is an allegory, well, of the Republic.
France.
Of France, not
The
the
Republic, more specifically. And the United States had allegorical personifications as well. Columbia was her name, and you can find her on all the coins and posters and so forth. So there is a female personification of the nation, but I don't know that she ever stands for the people. That's liberty.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's often, somebody pointed out it's often through autonomy instead of, metaphor, it's often a part for the whole. So you get a few people who are supposed to stand in for the people. And it's often Ernesto Leclau is a theorist, and he says there's always like one social group that you use to kind of quickly point to the people. And so for Trump, it was coal miners. Like coal miners became kind of the group that he always put, saying these are the people. And he's not saying everyone's a coal miner, right? But he's saying the coal miners, in a sense, are who we should think about when we think about the people. And so there's often like a subgroup who get, Leclau's term is privileged. And it's only rhetorically privileged, right? It doesn't mean you're going to actually benefit, per se, from this movement, right? But the rhetoric is privileging you, saying, yeah, you're the people we are thinking about. So in that sense, there's often that, but it's not quite embodiment. Embodiment wouldn't be quite the right word here.
Right. Or it's like it's synecdoche.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Any other questions? Nora and then Paul.
I'm trying to untangle my brain here, but was I hearing you right, sort of when you were describing the flip in the 18th century, so that the people initially were like the landowning, voting, right, men, and then after that they were sort of illiterate from the soil, non-landing. Okay.
Which I think, just to insert one thing, I think in American context, that's like a Jacksonian moment when it flips, when it's not just,
So I'm curious actually about sort of, I want to go back to politics for a minute, but I want to, I just keep thinking about sort of Depression era photography and then sort of FDR in World War II. And sort of because I have such a reactionary, right now in this particular political moment, populism really seems very reactionary, very right. But at that point, it kind of wasn't. So I'm curious about that.
And in Europe, right, there's a strong populist element of fascism. Whereas in the U.S., that's more muted. And instead, 30s populism is almost always associated with the left. And in Mexico, too, one thing I had kind of fun time doing with this one writer, Irish writer, spent time in Mexico, and you got to meet Diego Rivera and all these muralists who are depicting the people. Like a lot of Rivera's paintings say like the pueblo. Like that's what he's trying to depict. And he's clearly associated with the left. So yeah, it's something similar in the 30s, where there is a cultural populism that is still visible in New York. You can still see in New York.
Right. I just find it really interesting that somebody like, well, for instance, FDR, for example, is going to sort of define the populace or populism, right, and then sort of re-endow like money and voting rights and like sort of re-endow this other sort of idea of
I think populism is about getting power. What it does with that power is always that's case by case basis, right? Exactly. But yeah, the murals and stuff.
You mentioned toward the beginning of your talk that some of the story was religiously coded, and just as you interestingly differentiated between Protestant graffiti and Catholic graffiti in Belfast, was there also a Catholic style of writing and a Protestant style of literary expression?
For a long time, this is part of the scandal of Irish literature generally, is that for a long time, there's hardly any Catholic writing at all. That so much of it's done by the Protestant elites. And that's what makes Joyce so exceptional, is that he's this Catholic world figure. But so many of the writers, like Oscar Wilde, Yeats, Lady Gregory, even Sean Casey, who comes from a Protestant background, So I would hesitate to say there's a different style, but clearly there's like these different traditions, right, that they both kind of swim through, but in very different ways. And the tension is always between when the Protestants try to speak on behalf of the Catholic majority, and that's often where there's all sorts of tension. But again, there's kind of like it's almost like a scandal, because some of the greatest Irish political leaders were Protestant. And so there's this kind of big gap in kind of Catholic representation that changes in the 20th century once independence comes. But yeah, there's definitely a distinction there. And increasingly, populism gets associated with Catholicism in an ethnic sense. And Yates becomes more and more kind of crankily Protestant. He'll start like be more explicit in his distaste for Catholicism, whereas when he was younger, he found ways, especially with myth, like Celtic myth, to kind of smooth over the differences between Catholics and Protestants. Like, well, we all believe in leprechaun, right? That unites us. And so it's a very clever way of kind of getting past that. Whereas when he got older, he was no longer having it, and so then he starts really going on the attack against Catholic representation.
Thank you.